It is the business of the Chassid to live now for the realization of this Messianic Age. Paul Philip Levertoff.
One of the things that's difficult for many Jewish believers today is that they don't have a strong background in their own Jewish identities or in Judaism in general. And so a lot of times decisions are based off of misinformation or assumptions that people make about things. For example, Levertoff writes strongly from a background of mysticism. And I know this is sort of a little bit scary to a lot of Jewish believers today and people in the wider Messianic Jewish community. However, just to put it in context for you, because this really is important, from an academic perspective, Jewish mysticism can include everything from portions of the Bible, Ezekiel 1, the book of the Revelation, some of these very sort of mystical, elevated visions that you have within Scripture, all the way to today, there's still Jewish mysticism. So Jewish mysticism is much bigger than just Kabbalah. For example, most people assume that Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism are the same thing. And Kabbalah is only a type of Jewish mysticism. In the earlier forms of Jewish mysticism from the 1st and 2nd, 3rd centuries is all straight from Scripture. So I don't think you should always use caution with whatever that you study, but I don't think we have to be afraid of this. I think knowledge is power. And if you understand what you're talking about and are familiar and educated with what it is, then you can speak more intelligently about it, and you're able to divide between, what is right, what is wrong, and what is just simply, knowledge and interesting background information. So during the 1800s, this was actually a classical period for Messianic Judaism, whereas most people feel that the modern Messianic movement really only goes back to the 60s, which in a way it does, the current congregational movement, but Jewish believers have always been around. And there was a golden age during the 1800s of people like Paul Philip Levertoff, who we're going to be looking at in just a moment, of Yechiel Tzvi Lichtenstein, of a number of Jewish believers whose writings were so important in shaping the identity of Jews who believed in Yeshua, who believed in Jesus during the 1800s, that most of us are just not familiar with. And I, as a Jew, am so moved by the thinking of these Jewish believers, because whereas most of us are just so untapped into our own Yiddishkeit, into our own Jewishness, these are people who are thoroughly understood Jewish life, Jewish thought. Somebody like Levertoff, Paul Philip Levertoff was a Jewish believer who was born in Belarus to a Hasidic family. He's actually a descendant of the Alter Rebbe, of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who founded the Chabad movement. And he grew up studying at the Volozhin Yeshiva, which is like kind of one of the premier yeshivot in Europe prior to the Second World War. After he got ordination at the age of 16, he went to Germany to work on a doctorate, and it was while he was in Germany that he became a believer in Yeshua. And he became very influential in some of his writings, not just as a Jewish academic, but specifically as a Jewish believer. And when he made it to England, he composed a small text called Love in the Messianic Age, which was actually really a compilation of a much larger work that he did in German. And the English title is basically called The Religious Ideals of the Hasidim. And Love in the Messianic Age was a portion of this that he composed in English. And it's really an apologetic. It's an apologetic not so much to Jews, but to Christians who had this kind of misconception that there's nothing spiritual about Judaism, that it's a legal formulated religion. And he wanted to use only Jewish sources and show not just kind of mystical concept, but he wanted to show a deep spirituality within Judaism to kind of inform Christians who would read this and think differently about Judaism and about Jewish believers, and why it would be important for Jewish believers to retain their Jewish identities. After he became a believer, he became a member of the Anglican Church. So he was an Anglican priest and actually held a very high position in the Anglican Church. If you're familiar with N.T. Wright, who's a very famous scholar, his position in the Anglican Church is actually what Levertoff held 100 years ago. I really love Levertoff because he was a Jewish believer who, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, was ahead of the ball game, if you will, that He envisioned Messianic synagogues before there were Messianic synagogues. Levertoff would conduct services for it was an Anglican Hebrew church of Jews who converted to Anglicanism, but he included Jewish liturgy within it. And even though he would wear his Anglican vestments, he would wear a tallis, he would wear a prayer shawl, and they would do a Torah service. So he really was trying to implement the idea of a Jewish service very early in his time. Levertoff never stopped being a Jew in any way, not just in the way that he led his services, but the way that he thought. He always referred to himself as this sort of lone chassid in a Christian world. Even though he was part of this Christian world, he always realized that he wasn't quite there. He never quite fit in. I always think about Levertoff with the title of another great work by a famous Rav, Yosef Soloveitchik, who wrote a book called The Lonely Man of Faith. And that was really Levertoff. The Lonely Man of Faith was Levertoff. He was this lone chassid in a Christian world who wrote, in Hebrew and German and English, but primarily in Hebrew. And he thought, from very Jewish understanding about his own life, his own spirituality, and what he was trying to envision and make happen. So Love in the Messianic Age is really a glimpse into what it would be like for a yeshiva-educated Orthodox Jew prior to influence of Christianity, prior to all of this stuff. How would he interpret it? How would he interpret the New Testament, and particularly the book of John? John is actually considered a mystical text. It's the mystical gospel, if you will. So when you are able to look at Jewish mystical literature and then look at the book of John, you're going to see similarities which are, absolutely astounding.